Hi, I'm Yelena. In this video, I'll show you how to make the 𝗂𝗵𝗋 laptop sleeve, a stylish and functional case that comes in two sizes, 15 and 13 inches. This pattern features clean piping along the entire perimeter of the sleeve and across the top edge of the front pocket. The back panel includes a roomy zippered pocket that fits a tablet or notebook. Inside, you'll find a beautifully clean finish with no raw edges. The base version includes piping, but I'll also show you how to make a simplified pocket version. Perfect if you don't have a piping foot or just want to keep your project quick and easy. The printed pattern includes both pocket options, with piping and without, so you can choose the one that best fits your style. I love how flexible this pattern is. You can sew it in one solid color, mix and match different fabrics like I did, or even personalize it with embroidery. I actually plan to use this pattern to make a few handmade gifts for the upcoming holidays. And if you like this project or want to try the pattern yourself, you can find it in my shop. The link is in the description below. So grab your materials and let's get started. As I mentioned earlier, the pattern includes two front pocket options. Each piece is clearly labeled. One says version without piping, and the other version with piping. For the exterior fabric, I'm using medium weight cotton in two colors, gray for the main body and a soft floral print for the front pocket. For the lining, I'm using lightweight cotton. You'll also need two zippers. I recommend using them in a closed format, already with the zipper pull attached. That makes the sewing process much easier. Try to choose flexible zippers so they curve nicely and look smooth in the finished sleeve. We'll also need cord piping, a piping foot, and a zipper foot. For the side panel piece, make sure to follow the grain line carefully. This part shouldn't stretch. It needs to stay stable for a clean final shape. For the filler, I'm using batting with a weight of about 200 grams per square meter, or roughly 6 ounces per square yard. It's the same type I use for most of my projects. It holds its shape well, doesn't compress when pressed, and keeps the sleeve soft yet protective. For step 0, we'll prepare all the pieces for quilting. Cut the lining for the main panels with an extra 2.5 centimeters or 1 inch on each side. Cut the batting slightly larger, about 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch, to prevent any shifting during quilting. The extra allowance depends on your batting, so adjust if needed. For the side panel, cut the lining exactly to the pattern and cut the batting just a bit larger around the edges. You'll find a more detailed explanation in the sewing guide. For step 1, we're going to mark 2 perpendicular lines at a 45-degree angle on the lining piece. I'm using one ruler that already has a 45-degree marking and placing a second ruler along it to draw the first line. You can do this in any way that feels comfortable, or even mark the lines freely, since they don't affect the construction of the sleeve. After that, draw a second line perpendicular to the first one. Then, pin the lining to the batting. Pin it however you like. I usually place the pins along the marked line, but use whatever method works best for you. After that, we can start quilting. I'm beginning with the first line, removing the pins as I go and using the longest stitch length on my machine. After finishing that first pass, I sew a parallel line about 2 inches away. But you can choose any spacing you prefer, since it doesn't affect the construction. I just don't recommend making the quilting too tight or dense. Once this direction is done, turn the panel and quilt the second set of lines, using the perpendicular guideline we marked earlier and keeping the same spacing you used in the first direction. Repeat this process to quilt the second panel the same way. When the quilting is finished, give the panel some steam. If your batting tends to flatten, keep the iron slightly above the surface and let the steam do the work. We want to keep the panel soft and puffy for extra protection. With the quilting and pressing done, the panels are ready to be cut to their final shape. You'll need to cut 2 identical panels, following the outline of the pattern. Don't forget to mark the center notches. I like folding the panel in half and making small snips instead of marking directly on the printed pattern. For the side panel, place the lining piece on top of the batting, leaving an even amount of space around all sides. This extra room will make sewing easier. Then pin the layers together to keep everything in place. Now we can secure the side panel by stitching around the entire perimeter. I'm sewing about 3 to 5 millimeters from the edge, using the longest stitch length on my machine. I sew along one side. Keep the needle down at each corner, turn the panel, and continue around all 4 sides in one pass. After stitching, remove the pins and give the piece a light press. If your batting tends to flatten, keep the iron just above the surface and let the steam shape the panel without pressing it down. We want to keep the volume here as well. Now we can trim the edges. I'm cutting away the excess batting all around the side panel, keeping the edges clean and even. With this done, the lining pieces are fully prepared and ready for the next steps. If you're not planning to use piping and you cut the pieces for the no piping version, you can skip this step and move on to the next variation. For the piping version, place the piping along the top edge of the exterior front pocket piece, aligning the raw edge of the piping with the raw edge of the fabric. Pin it in place. And if you're a beginner, you may want to baste it first. You'll need a piping foot for this step. Now we can stitch the piping to the pocket piece. Sew 1 centimeter or about 3/8 of an inch from the edge, sewing right into the groove of the piping cord. I'm using a stitch length of about 2.5 to 3 millimeters. Place the lining piece right sides together with the pocket piece, aligning the top edges, and pin or baste it in place. The piping should now be sandwiched between the 2 layers. Now we can stitch the layers together. Our goal here is to sew directly into the previous stitching line. To do that, place the lining on the bottom and keep using the same piping foot so the needle follows the groove of the cord. Don't forget to add a back stitch at the beginning and at the end of the seam. Let's start by giving this seam a good press. I'm steaming it from the lining side first to smooth the entire seam. Then I fold the lining away and press the edge from the right side. After that, I turn the pocket fully right side out, shape the piping with my fingers, and press the top edge again before setting the seam with my pressing pillow. Use a pressing pillow to set the seam and let it cool in place. If you'd like to make one, you can find a tutorial with a free downloadable pattern on my channel. Here's what the finished result should look like. If you'd like, you can also add an optional decorative top stitch along the piping using a stitch length of 3.5 to 5 millimeters. To prepare the center seam on the front pocket, I'm starting by marking the center points at the top and bottom. First, I place the pattern on the pocket piece and transfer the notches. After that, I fold the pocket in half to double-check my marks and make sure they're perfectly aligned. Once the marks match, I place a ruler on the pocket and draw a straight vertical line connecting them. This guideline will show us exactly where to sew the center seam in the next step. Now we can attach the pocket to the front panel. I'm placing the finished pocket on top of the main exterior panel and aligning the bottom edges. Then I pin the layers together to keep everything in place. We'll sew the center seam from the bottom all the way up and finish it with a horizontal back stitch in one pass to secure the pocket. First, I place a clean back stitch at the bottom of the pocket and start sewing the center seam upward with a stitch length of 2.5 millimeters. When I reach the piping, I stop with the needle down right in the ditch, between the piping and the main fabric. Then I pivot the pocket, shorten the stitch length to about 2 millimeters, and sew 3 stitches forward to anchor the seam. After that, I sew 6 stitches backward, and then a few stitches forward again to finish the bar tack and make it as secure as possible. This horizontal reinforcement is very important. If we sew only a straight vertical seam and stop right at the piping, this area will take a lot of stress during everyday use, and the seam may eventually tear. By adding this small horizontal bar tack, we reinforce the top of the pocket and prevent any problems in the future. Now we need to reduce the bulk at the ends of the piping. I'm gently opening the fabric of the piping and pulling out about 1 centimeter, or roughly 3/8 of an inch, of the cord from each end. You can do this with scissors or a small pair of tweezers, whichever feels more comfortable. Once the cord is exposed, I trim it off and repeat the same on the other side. Removing this little bit of cord helps avoid unnecessary thickness when we join all the layers later. The next step is attaching the piping around the panel. I begin by preparing one end of the piping. I gently open the fabric casing, pull out about 1 centimeter, or roughly 3/8 of an inch, of the cord and trim it off. Then I fold the empty end of the piping under at about a 90-degree angle. This helps me clearly see where the cord begins inside the piping and makes the final join much cleaner later on. Once that end is prepared, I start pinning the piping to the panel. I'm beginning right at the seam where the pocket was attached earlier, but you can start wherever it feels comfortable for you. Since the piping is cut on the bias, it should curve nicely around the edges. I gently stretch it as I pin, not too much, just a light tension, so it sits smoothly against the shape of the panel. If I don't apply that little bit of tension, the piping can ripple or form small waves as I sew, and then I'd need to reposition the pins while stitching. If you're new to working with piping, I highly recommend basting it in place. It takes a little extra time, but it helps keep everything neat and prevents shifting during stitching. I continue pinning all the way around the perimeter. When I reach the point where the piping will eventually be joined, I leave the loose end unpinned for now. We'll connect the 2 ends directly at the machine during the stitching step. Now we're ready to stitch the piping in place all around the panel. I'm starting right at the point where the cord inside the piping begins. You can add a small back stitch here if you'd like, but it isn't required. Using a piping foot and a 2.5 millimeter stitch length, I begin sewing along the entire perimeter, removing the pins as I go. I'm stitching either directly in the original stitching line of the piping or as close as possible to the cord inside. This keeps the piping smooth even and nicely defined on the finished panel. If you feel the piping shift on the curves, simply stop and adjust your foot position to help guide it smoothly around the shape. I do this on nearly every rounded edge. And if a bit of extra ease appears, you can lift the foot, reposition the piping with your fingers, and continue stitching. As I get closer to where the piping ends will meet, I usually stop about 3 to 5 centimeters, or 1 to 2 inches before the starting point. I pause and mark the join. I lay one end of the piping over the other and mark exactly where they meet using a fabric marker or tailor's chalk. Then I trim the excess, leaving about 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch of seam allowance on the end I'm going to join. Next, I pull out the inner cord from this short tail up to the mark I just made. I'm using tweezers here. It makes this step much easier. This part may look a little tricky on camera because I'm working very close to the lens, but in real life, it's much more comfortable and goes a lot faster. Once the cord is removed, both piping cords will meet perfectly end-to-end without overlapping. Now I fold each fabric tail at a 90-degree angle so the two ends meet cleanly inside the seam. The upper tail folds downward and the lower tail folds upward. This helps the edges align neatly without adding extra bulk at the join. I pin this little overlap to keep everything in place, then continue stitching. I sew across the join and slightly onto the stitching I started with, finishing with a small backstitch. After the seam is complete, I trim away any extra bulk in the seam allowance around the join. This helps the piping lie flat and keeps the finished edge looking smooth and even. Here's what the completed join should look like: clean, flat, and neatly aligned. Now we just need to give the entire panel a good press. I'm steaming it well to smooth out the seam allowance and help the piping settle into its final shape. And with that, the main version of the front pocket is finished. It's fully pressed. The piping is smooth and even, and the panel is ready for assembly. Let's prepare the pocket for the no piping version. First, I'm placing the exterior piece and the lining right sides together. Then I'm aligning the top edges carefully. And once everything is matched up, I pin the pieces in place along the top edge. Now we can sew the top edge. I'm stitching with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance, and I'm adding back stitches at the beginning and at the end. The stitch length is 2.5 millimeters. For this step, make sure the lining is facing down as you sew. It helps keep the seam smooth and prevents shifting. Let's press the seam we just stitched. I'm starting with a simple steam press to smooth everything out. Then I fold the lining toward the seam allowance and press the seam from the right side again, pushing the seam allowance toward the lining. Next, I flip the pocket to the wrong side, open the seam, and press it flat. Then I turn it back to the right side and give it another quick press to make sure the seam lies nice and smooth. I'm setting the seam with my pressing pillow to help it cool in place and hold its shape. Now I'm folding the pocket in half, matching the rounded bottom edges. At this stage, you'll also want to press the fold so the pocket lies clean and flat. My camera didn't catch that moment, but just make sure to give that fold a good press before moving on. Let's add a top stitch to the pocket. I'm stitching 3.5 centimeters, or about 1 3/8 inches, down from the top edge. If your machine has guide markings, feel free to use them. They really help keep the top stitching straight. I like using a stitch length of 3.5 millimeters, but you can go anywhere between 3.5 and 5 millimeters depending on the look you prefer. Here's how the top stitch looks from both sides. Once it's done, give the pocket a good steam press to set the stitching. Next, we need to mark the center of the pocket panel, just like we did in the piping version. You can transfer the notches from the printed pattern, but I prefer simply folding the pocket in half and marking the center at both the top and bottom. Then I use a ruler to draw a straight vertical line that will guide my stitching. After that, place the pocket onto the main exterior panel, align the bottom edges, and pin it in place. Now we're ready to stitch the center line from the bottom to the top, finishing with a horizontal reinforcement stitch at the top. Let's stitch the pocket in place. I'm sewing from the bottom up using a 2.5 millimeter stitch length, and I start with a secure back stitch. I'm stopping just a couple of millimeters before reaching the top edge of the pocket. I usually leave about 2 to 3 millimeters. With the needle down, I pivot the piece 90 degrees, shorten my stitch length to 2 millimeters, and sew a short horizontal reinforcement at the top. I'm making about 3 stitches forward, 6 stitches back, and another 3 to 4 stitches forward. This creates a strong, clean reinforcement that helps prevent the seam from pulling open with use. Here's how mine looks when it's done. Next, we need to stitch the pocket to the exterior panel. I'm sewing about 2 to 3 millimeters, or roughly 1/8 of an inch, from the edge. This seam simply keeps all the layers secured so nothing shifts as we continue building the sleeve. I'm using a longer stitch length, anywhere between 3.5 and 5 millimeters. There's no need for back stitches here, since this line isn't structural. It just holds everything in place. Once the seam is finished, go ahead and remove the pins. Then give the entire panel a good steam press so the layers sit flat and the pocket is fully stabilized for the next steps. Now let's get started on preparing the back panel. I'm beginning with the zipper end tabs. Place the square of exterior fabric right sides together with the zipper, aligning it with the short end of the zipper tape. Then place the lining piece on the back, right side to the wrong side of the zipper, creating a small fabric sandwich. Pin everything in place. We'll repeat this same setup for the other end of the zipper. Let's sew the zipper tabs in place. I'm stitching 1 centimeter, or about 3/8 of an inch, from the edge using a 2.5 millimeter stitch length. The lining piece should be on the bottom as you sew. Just sew straight across the tab, keeping everything aligned as you go. Let's give these seams a good press. I'm starting by steaming the seam flat to smooth everything out. Then I fold the exterior tab away from the zipper and press the seam allowance toward the tab. After that, I flip to the other side, fold the lining tab away from the zipper, and press that seam allowance in the same way. This is how the zipper end should look once both sides are pressed. Repeat the same process for the second zipper tab. Now let's add a top stitch to secure the tabs. I'm stitching about 2 to 3 millimeters, or roughly 1/8 of an inch, from the seam using a stitch length between 3.5 and 5 millimeters. Repeat the same top stitching on the other end of the zipper, and give everything a light press if you'd like. After that, we just need to trim the edges. I'm cutting away the excess fabric on both sides of the zipper so the zipper tape lines up cleanly with the tabs. Here's how it should look once everything is trimmed. Then we need to mark the centers on the zipper. I'm folding the zipper in half, matching the zipper tabs so their seams line up perfectly. From here, you can mark the center points with pins, like I'm doing, or use tailor's chalk, whatever feels easier for you. Before attaching the zipper, make sure the opening direction works for you. I'm opening and closing it here just to double check that the pull will be positioned the way I want in the finished sleeve. Then we can place the zipper onto the lower exterior panel of the back pocket. Position it right sides together, match the center marks, and pin it in place along the top edge. Using a zipper foot, I'm stitching 1 centimeter, or about 3/8 of an inch, from the edge. My stitch length here is between 2.5 and 3 millimeters. I'm not adding back stitches at the beginning or the end of this seam, because this is a supporting line of stitching. It won't be removed, and a later seam will be sewn directly into it as we continue building the back pocket. Let's add the lining to this part of the back pocket. I'm placing the lower lining panel right sides together with the exterior piece, with the zipper sandwiched neatly between the 2 layers. You can use the center notches as a reference point if you'd like, but I'm starting my pinning right from the edge, aligning the exterior and lining layers together without worrying about the zipper tabs for now. I'm pinning all the way across the top edge. The zipper tabs will stick out on both sides. That's exactly how it should be. We'll trim that extra length later once the entire back panel is assembled. Now we can sew the lining to the zipper. I'm stitching 1 centimeter, or about 3/8 of an inch, from the edge, and I'm using my zipper foot so I can sew right into that previous supporting seam. The lining needs to stay on the bottom as you sew. I'm starting with a back stitch, removing the pins as I go, and finishing with another back stitch at the end. Unlike the previous seam, the back stitches here are important. This is one of the structural seams of the zipper. Let's give the seam a really good press before moving on. I'm starting by steaming the seam we just stitched, just to smooth everything out and set the stitches in place. Then I'm folding the exterior panel away from the zipper and pressing along the seam from the right side. Here, I'm making sure the fabric lies perfectly flat and doesn't create any bulk along the zipper teeth. A clean press here will make the top stitching in the next step much easier. After that, I flip the piece over and fold the lining away from the zipper as well, pressing that seam from both the wrong side and the right side. Again, the goal is to keep all the layers smooth so nothing shifts or puckers when we sew the top stitch next. I'm setting the seam with my pressing pillow to help it cool in place and hold its shape. Time to add the top stitch along the zipper. I'm sewing about 2 millimeters, or just under 1/8 of an inch, from the edge, using the same stitch length I used on the zipper tabs, anywhere between 3.5 and 5 millimeters. Keeping the stitch length consistent gives the finished sleeve a really clean, polished look. Sew all the way across the seam, and don't forget to add back stitches at the beginning and at the end to secure the top stitching. Next, we're adding the upper exterior part of the back pocket. I'm placing this piece right sides together with the zipper, lining up the center notches first. Then I pin along the entire edge to secure the layers. This upper panel will complete the back pocket construction, so make sure the edges stay aligned as you pin. Let's stitch this seam in place. I'm sewing 1 centimeter, or about 3/8 of an inch from the edge using a 2.5 millimeter stitch length. This seam is just a supporting stitch, so back stitching at the beginning and end is optional. Next, let's add the lining for the upper pocket section. I'm placing the lining piece right side down onto the wrong side of the zipper, matching the center notches just like we did before. Then I pin it in place along the entire edge. At this stage, the zipper should be sandwiched between the outer fabric and the lining. That's exactly what we want before stitching. Now we can stitch these layers together. I'm sewing 1 centimeter, or 3/8 of an inch from the edge, keeping the lining on the bottom. I'm stitching directly into the previous seam, removing the pins as I go. Make sure to add a secure back stitch at the beginning and at the end. This seam needs to hold everything firmly in place. I'm starting by steaming the seam we just stitched to smooth everything out. Then I turn the upper outer panel to the right side and press along the seam, making sure the fabric lies clean and flat. Next, I do the same with the lining, folding it away from the zipper and pressing the seam from the lining side. Once both layers are opened and pressed, I flip everything to the right side and give the seam a final steam press so it sits perfectly along the zipper. I'm setting the seam with my pressing pillow to help it cool in place and keep the edge crisp. Here's how it should look once everything is pressed and set. Now let's add the top stitching. I'm stitching just a couple of millimeters from the edge, using the same top stitch length as before, anywhere between 3.5 and 5 millimeters, depending on what you chose earlier. Make sure to place secure back stitches at the beginning and end of the seam. And once the stitching is done, give the whole piece a quick steam press to set everything in place. Next, trim the excess from the zipper tabs. I'm just cutting off the little extensions on both sides so the zipper edges are perfectly flush. Let's attach the back pocket to the exterior panel. I'm laying the finished pocket on top of the exterior piece and taking a moment to position it evenly. Once everything looks centered and aligned, I'm pinning all the layers together. This helps keep the pocket from shifting later when we start assembling the back panel. Now we need to pin the piping to the back panel. If you're sewing the no piping version, you can simply skip this step. Just like before, I'm starting by opening the fabric casing on one end of the piping and removing about 1 centimeter, or roughly 3/8 of an inch, of the inner cord. I trim it off, and that gives me a clean, flexible starting point. I like to begin pinning at the lower center notch of the panel. You can start anywhere you prefer, but beginning at the center helps keep everything even. With the right side of the back panel facing up, I place the piping along the raw edge, aligning the stitching ridge with the edge of the fabric. As I pin, I keep a light tension on the piping, just enough to help it sit smoothly around the curves without forming ripples. This is the same technique we used earlier. Gentle stretch, even spacing, and smooth shaping. I continue pinning all the way around the panel, leaving the final short tail of the piping unpinned for now. We'll complete the join directly at the machine in the next step. If you're sewing the no piping version, you can skip the piping instructions here. Instead, stitch the layers together along the edge using a seam allowance of 2 to 3 millimeters. That's about 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch, using a stitch length of 3.5 to 5 millimeters. This step is simply to secure all the layers, just like we did back in step 19. If you're sewing the piping version, now we can stitch the piping to the back panel. I'm using a 2.5 millimeter stitch length, and I'm starting right where the inner cord begins. From here, the process is exactly the same as what we did earlier in step 17 on the front panel. Since that step already covers the full technique in detail, I won't repeat the long explanation here. The method is identical. When you get close to the joining point, leave yourself a few centimeters of space. Then join the two ends the same way we did earlier. Trim the extra length. Pull out a short section of cord. Fold the fabric ends at 90 degrees in opposite directions, and nest them together so the join sits flat without extra bulk. I'll show a quick overview of how it looks here. Once the join is made, finish stitching across that area, overlap the beginning slightly, add a small back stitch if you prefer, and the piping is fully attached. Let's trim away the extra bulk at the piping join to keep this area flat and prevent a thick spot in the finished sleeve. I'm carefully clipping the excess fabric layers around the join, just enough to reduce the thickness without cutting into the stitching. After trimming, I'm giving the panel a quick steam press so everything lies smooth and even. And that's it. Both the front and back panels are now fully prepared and ready for assembly. Let's get the side panel ready. I'm taking the exterior side panel and placing it right sides together with the zipper, matching the short edge of the panel with the short edge of the zipper tape. I'm pinning it in place. Then I take the lining side panel and place it right sides together with the back of the zipper, again matching the short edges. Once everything is aligned, I pin the layers together to create a neat little sandwich around the zipper. Repeat this same process on the other side of the zipper. Before moving on, I'm taking a quick moment to check that nothing is twisted. All layers should be facing the correct direction. Now we can stitch both sides of the zipper. I'm sewing with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. That's about 3/8 of an inch, using a 2.5 millimeter stitch length, and I'm adding back stitches at the beginning and the end to secure the seam. After that, I'm giving both seams a quick press to smooth everything out. Then I turn the zipper and panels right side out, spread the layers flat, and press again to set the shape. And this is how the side panel should look at this stage. Let's add the top stitching and secure all layers in one go. I start by stitching along the first short edge, keeping my seam about 2 to 3 millimeters from the fold. With the needle down, I pivot and continue stitching along the long edge. I'm using a stitch length of 3.5 millimeters, but feel free to adjust it to match the top stitching you've used throughout your project. Then I pivot again, stitch across the second short edge, and make one more pivot to finish the final long edge. This single continuous seam both top stitches the panel and secures all layers together. Keeping the lining side down helps prevent shifting, and gently smoothing the layers as you sew will ensure there's no uneven overlap along the edges. This is how your side panel should look at this stage. If you see any batting extending past the edges, you can trim that excess just like I'm doing here. This step is completely optional, but it helps keep the outline clean and even. Let's move on to assembling the sleeve. Before we start, I'm checking the zipper direction to make sure it opens the way I want. Next, I fold the side panel in half, matching the seams where the fabric meets the zipper. Once the edges are aligned, I mark the center point. You can use a pin or a fabric marker. Now I match the center of the zipper to the center mark on the front panel and pin that spot in place. From there, I continue pinning outward to the left and right. When I reach the rounded areas, I make a few shallow snips into the zipper tape, just tiny clips to help it bend smoothly around the curve. These should never be deep, just small notches to release the tension. I keep pinning all the way around the panel. Then I ease the fabric panel around the curve and add a few matching shallow clips to the fabric seam allowance where needed. This helps both layers fit together without puckering. Once everything is pinned, I pause to double-check that the zipper is positioned evenly on both sides of the pocket. The distance from the zipper to the pocket edge should be the same on the left and right. This quick check helps keep the finished pouch clean and symmetrical. Now, I highly recommend basting this seam before we move to the machine. I just want you to see how it should look once everything is basted and ready for the next step. I'm not going into detail on how to baste, since you probably already have your preferred method. This is the perfect moment to check for any little tucks or folds and smooth them out before we sew the final seam. And along the rounded areas, try to keep your basting stitches a bit shorter so the layers stay securely in place. Now let's stitch the panels together using the piping foot. I'm sewing 1 centimeter, or about 3/8 of an inch from the edge, aiming to stitch right into the original piping seam for the cleanest finish. Since we removed the pins earlier, it's easier to stay precise and follow that seam line. I'm using a 2.5 millimeter stitch length, and don't forget to add a back stitch at the beginning and end. When you reach the zipper pull, keep the needle down, lift the presser foot, slide the pull out of the way, lower the foot again, and continue stitching to the end of the curve. Once the seam is finished, check the outside of the panel to make sure there are no tucks or folds. Then remove the basting thread. Now we need to trim away the extra bulk at the spot where the pocket was attached. I'm gently opening the seam with my fingers and cutting off the small corner of piping that creates the extra thickness. Make sure to trim only the excess, not the stitching line, just that little wedge of piping that sits inside the seam. Repeat the same trimming on the opposite side. Let's attach the finished side panel to the back panel. First, partially unzip the zipper, but keep the pull at the top. Don't open it all the way. If the pull slides too far down, it becomes harder to move it out of the way while sewing. Now match the center notch on the zipper to the center notch on the back panel and pin that point in place. Just like we did on the front panel, I start pinning along the straight edges first. When I reach the curved areas, I make a few shallow clips in the seam allowance, just tiny snips that help the layers shape smoothly around the curve without creating any tucks or folds. I do this on both the zipper side and the fabric allowance, anywhere the layers need a little extra ease. Then I continue pinning all the way around the panel, making sure everything lies flat and even. After that, baste all the layers in place just like we did before. This helps you check the curves for any tiny tucks, folds, or uneven tension before sewing the final seam. Now we can stitch the side panel to the front panel. I'm using a piping foot and sewing with a 2.5 millimeter stitch length. keeping my seam about 1 centimeter, or 3/8 of an inch, from the edge. Try to sew right into the previous piping seam for the cleanest finish. At one point, you may need to slide the zipper pull out of the way. This can be a little tricky, but it's much easier because we kept the pull at the top on a straight section of the zipper tape. Just lift the presser foot with the needle down, shift the pull, and keep going. Don't forget to backstitch at the beginning and end of the seam. And once the stitching is done, remove all the basting threads. Now we're ready to attach the lining to the exterior. I'm taking the quilted lining panel and placing it right sides together with the wrong side of the laptop sleeve. Before pinning, I'm checking the zipper pull. It should still be open, but not pushed around the corner. Next, I match the center notch at the top of the lining to the center notch of the zipper on the opposite side of the sleeve and pin them together. From that center point, I keep pinning outward along the straight edge. Then I move to the bottom. I match the bottom center notch on the lining to the center of the opposite side of the exterior panel and pin that in place as well. Again, I pin along the straight edges first. This keeps everything aligned and helps prevent shifting later on. Now I'm moving to the short sides. I pin the flat areas on the left and right, leaving only the corners unpinned for now. For the corners, I gently smooth the lining around the curve and let it extend slightly beyond the exterior piece. I'm not trying to force the edges to match perfectly. What matters is that the lining lies smoothly with no tension, folds, or little bumps. Once it's shaped nicely, I pin it in place. I repeat the same process for all 4 corners. At this stage, the lining should be pinned evenly all the way around the perimeter. If you're unsure or want a cleaner result, I recommend basting the layers, especially near the zipper area, where sewing can feel a little tight because the main body of the sleeve is folded inside. And we need to leave an opening at the bottom for turning the sleeve right side out later. I'm leaving a gap of about 16 centimeters, or roughly 6¼ inches. Now we're ready to sew the lining and exterior together. I'm using a piping foot again, and I'm stitching directly into the previous seam for the cleanest finish. I'm keeping a 1 centimeter seam allowance. That's about 3/8 of an inch. Don't forget to add a backstitch at the beginning. As I sew around the curves, I'm taking my time, especially because I still have a few pins in place to hold the layers together. When I reach the zipper pull, I pause with the needle down, lift the presser foot, and slide my hand between the lining and exterior layers. From the inside, I gently move the zipper pull out of the way, lower the foot again, and continue sewing. At the bottom, I leave an opening for turning, about 16 centimeters or roughly 6¼ inches. And at the end of the seam, I add another secure back stitch, because this opening will take a lot of pressure when we turn the sleeve right side out. Now we need to trim down the excess bulk along the rounded corners and anywhere you notice the layers shifting. This will help the seams lay smooth once the sleeve is turned right side out. Next, I'm clipping and notching the curves. Instead of one large cut, I'm making several small V-shaped notches around each rounded corner. These little cuts remove extra fabric so the seam can open up naturally without creating any waves or folds. I repeat this on all 4 corners. Optionally, you can also make a couple of small snips along the long, straight edges. Whether you need them depends on the thickness and structure of your fabric, but they can help the seam relax more easily after turning. After that, we can turn the sleeve right side out. I'm pushing everything through the opening we left earlier and gently shaping the curves from the inside. Now we just need to close the turning opening by hand using a ladder stitch. I'm keeping this part brief, But if you'd like to see the full process step by step, you can watch it in my previous tutorials. Once the opening is closed, the lining is secure and we're ready to move on. And now let's attach the second lining panel. First, I'm sliding the zipper pull back to the top of the sleeve so it sits in the correct position. Then I place the quilted lining panel right sides together with the lining we just attached. Just like before, I match the top center notch of the lining to the center of the opposite zipper side and pin that point in place. From there, I pin outward along the straight edges. At the bottom, I also match and pin the center notches, leaving a gap for turning, the same size as before. On the curved areas, I gently smooth the lining into place and pin it the way it naturally lays, even if it extends slightly past the edges. I repeat this all the way around the panel, and that completes this step. Just like we did with the previous lining panel, we're sewing these layers together while leaving an opening at the bottom for turning later. I'm using the piping foot again and stitching directly into the existing seam to keep everything clean and consistent. Don't forget a secure back stitch at the beginning. As I approach the curved areas, I slow down a bit and follow the curve carefully. When I reach the zipper pull, I pause with the needle down, lift the presser foot, and gently shift the pull out of the way from the inside, exactly the same way we moved it earlier. At the end of the seam, I add another strong back stitch, since the opening will handle a lot of tension when we turn the sleeve right side out. Now we need to trim down the excess bulk along the rounded edges, just like we did before. I'm carefully reducing the batting where it feels a bit thick, especially around the curves. Next, I'm making small V-shaped notches along each rounded corner. Optionally, you can add 2 or 3 tiny snips along the long, straight edges as well. It depends on the thickness of your materials. Now we can turn the sleeve right side out. I'm carefully pushing the lining through the opening we left and gently shaping the curves and corners from the inside so everything lays flat. Once the sleeve is fully turned, take a moment to smooth out all the seams with your fingers and make sure the edges look clean and even. Next, close the turning opening by hand using an invisible ladder stitch. And once that's done, we can turn the entire sleeve right side out. I'm taking my time to shape the corners and smooth out all the seams from the inside. Then, using a pressing pillow, I give the whole sleeve a thorough steam press, gently opening up the curves, flattening the edges, and helping the structure settle into its final shape. This final press really pulls everything together and gives the sleeve a clean, crisp, fully finished look. We did it! Thank you so much for sewing along with me. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and learned something new today. If you'd like to share your thoughts, questions, or feedback, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Your messages truly mean a lot to me and help me make each new pattern and video even better. I can't wait to see your finished sleeve. Happy sewing!